Hello everyone, welcome back to one final video on biblical slavery. Today will be the final part. I guarantee you I will not make another video on this. Today is the very final time, because I believe I have come up with the best possible argument against biblical slavery, and I will like to share this with you today. If you have any criticisms, please leave them below. So we start with the verse that everybody always quotes, Leviticus 25:44 through 46. And of course, you can read it right there. I've read it so many times that I don't feel like it's necessary for me to read it again. What's interesting about this verse, and it should be noted, is the verses that go prior to it. What is the Bible necessarily speaking about when it is talking about slavery? Well, if you could find a definition from the Bible that was talking about what the Bible was pertaining to about slavery, then we could understand what the biblical text was meaning when it said slavery in this verse. So if we could possibly find a prior biblical verse which was defining what it meant by slavery, then perhaps we could better understand this, because it is unlikely that the Bible would just out of the blue talk about slavery. And in fact, we do have a verse like this. That would be Leviticus 25:39. Now, if a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to slave service. He shall work with you as a hired worker. What's interesting about this verse is the fact that the Bible is here saying that you shall not make of your fellow Hebrew, your fellow Israelite, a slave if he sells himself to you. This implies that if an Israelite was to sell themselves to you, they could not become a slave. They couldn't. They had to be a hired worker. So then, logical processes would imply to us that the next verse would be talking about the people who you shall subject to slaves if they sell themselves to you. This is also as to why we would expect the Israelites to be able to contain them forever. And I'll explain why in a little bit. But the main thing that you need to keep in mind is that the Bible very clearly is defining what it's talking about here. It is talking about a person who sells themselves to you. And if a foreigner sells themselves to you, then you may keep them. But if an Israelite is to do so, then you should only hire him as a worker. Again, key word, the Bible is indeed talking about selling somebody to you. From a volitional sense. Now, why on earth would you be allowed to keep them forever? Well, we also get this in a very few verses behind. We see it right here. If a countryman of yours becomes poor and his means among you falter, you are to sustain him like a stranger resident, so that he may live with you. Key word here, do not take any kind of interest from him. And we see this later in Deuteronomy as well. It says here that you aren't to exact any debt whatsoever from an Israelite, but you can do so from a foreigner. So if we are to indeed assume that a foreigner is a debt slave, and let's assume that they are, if the foreigner was a debt slave, they would eventually become poor. When they became poor, they couldn't get their debt freed during the year of Jubilee. And because their debt would not be forgiven, unlike the Israelites, they could be a slave forever, but it would have been out of their own volition. Because remember, they become poor due to debt, but once they sell themselves to you, the Israelites cannot free you of said debt, because they cannot do that according to the Bible. However, if an Israelite is to sell themselves to you, they cannot do that. They're a hired worker, and for that, they can be freed of all debt. That is why most Israelites will be freed of debt during the year of Jubilee. But the foreigner is not, therefore they are to be kept as slaves. But again, this is only because they do so out of their own will. The Bible makes it clear that in the Leviticus 25 verse, you can even read it, anyone will tell you that it is about poor people selling themselves to you, because each and every verse leading up to that is talking about a poor person selling to you. Why on earth would the Bible just change what it was talking about? All of a sudden, just go from talking about debt slaves selling them to you volitionally, all of a sudden to just talking about you capturing people. Makes absolutely no sense. So to make this very clear, to an Israelite, you could forgive them of debt. So when they became poor, it didn't really matter, because by the year of Jubilee, all would be forgiven. However, for a foreigner, things become a little bit more bad, because the problem with them is that if they were to become poor, one of the only options that they would have in debt would be to sell themselves. And since their debt could never be forgiven, they can't be released unless they're able to pay off their debt. Until they do so, they won't be freed. That is why the Bible says you can keep them in possession forever. Only because of their own volition, they became poor and needed to sell themselves off for debt. And then that debt, once paid off, they could be freed. if this makes any sense, I will continue making videos, of course, on biblical chronology and biblical facts. Until then, God bless and goodbye.